All right, so I'm Betsy DeWitt. I'm president of the League of Women Voters. Welcome to the online discussion on warrant articles. This is session one. We'll try to do at least one or two more. And I just want to remind everybody, League of Women Voters' mission is voter education, and it is a nonpartisan organization. We do our best to present information to help people understand the issues before them and then make decisions. This morning, we have two topics: short-term rentals, which will probably take up half of our time or more, and also one close to the heart of the League, which has to do with better access for voters to registration and to make voting easier. So on the short-term rentals, the Massachusetts legislature passed an act regulating short-term rentals that would authorize local regulation that would begin in July of 2019. Then the town planning and zoning staff with related boards and commissions did some research investigating the status of short-term rentals in Brookline. In 2020, the select board proposed a series of articles to the November town meeting, and those articles were referred to a moderator's committee on short-term rentals to clarify the status of short-term rental property. The committee was charged to propose a reasonable framework for the regulation of short-term rentals in Brookline, and then one that would address major objections that had been raised with regard to short-term rentals. Our speakers, Paul Warren and Maureen Coffey, both serve on the Moderators Committee. First, Paul Warren will speak on Articles 14, 15, and 16, and some additional amendments opposed by the town's advisory committee. And second, Maureen Coffey will speak on Article 17, which I gather also has a set of proposed amendments. And to be clear, Article 17 is a modified version of the information that's in Articles 14, 15, and 16. So I hope this will help to clarify people and not additionally confuse them. That said, Paul Warren, you have the floor on warrant articles 14, 15, and 16. Welcome.
Thank you, Betsy. I am going to share my screen, but before I begin, I just want to thank you for League of Women Voters in hosting these sessions. They are critical to educating not only town meeting members, but the population, residents at large. So thank you very much for the invite. I'm going to try to share my screen here.
And while you're doing that, I'm going to remind folks this is being recorded and will be available for future viewing through BIG.
Okay, I'm going to try to make sure I can see everything on my screen here.
I can see your screen.
I need to be able to see it, Betsy. Okay, so my name is Paul Warren. Oops, we're going to go back one here. Paul Warren, I am a member of the advisory committee. I'm also, as Betsy said, a member of the Moderators Committee. And today I'm straddling a little bit my perspective because advisory has modified these quite significantly, as well as Moderators Committee. I endeavor to inform you of the changes from that perspective. So
your goal, Paul, is to inform and try not to confuse.
I am gonna try to demystify this, Betsy, and that's really what my objective is here today. I'm gonna skip the background, Betsy, because I think you did a great job in leading up to how we got here. It's been a long saga of a multi-year approach to get to short-term rentals. So I'm gonna skip this slide. And I'm going to talk briefly about the current situation in Brookline. Short-term rentals are not a defined use in our zoning bylaw. And our zoning, if something is not defined in our zoning bylaw, it has been determined by the building commissioner and our zoning board of appeals that something is prohibited. So short-term rentals are not defined in our zoning bylaw. Therefore, the building commissioner has determined that they are not legal. So they are prohibited use. The building commissioner to date has been enforcing short-term rentals on a complaint-driven basis. There are some operating, but if he gets a complaint, he will generally shut them down. Importantly, there is a pending lawsuit challenging the Brookline Building Commissioner and the ZBA's determination that our zoning bylaw does not allow for the operation of short-term rentals in Brookline. That's important, and I will refer back to that in a little bit. This is my demystifying slide. There are multiple warrant articles that make up the short-term rental regulations. The first is Article 14, which is the zoning bylaw change, which allows a short-term, which creates a right of use in our zoning tables. Article 16 defines the agencies and departments within Brookline that would be responsible for enforcing short-term rentals. Then there's Article 15, which is the article that was put forward by the Short-Term Rentals Committee, which essentially has all the regulations in it. And then there's a competing Article 17, which is essentially Article 15 with some changes. The important thing to know about this is that much of all these regulations are the same. That's why I have this highlighted in blue. And really, there's just a few important differences between Article 15 and Article 17 that ultimately people will want to understand, and specifically town meeting members, because they'll have to make a choice between these two articles. By a quirk of our legislative process, Article 17 will actually be the main motion. So it's not the motion from advisory and in the short-term rentals committee. It's actually the petitioners of Article 17. They'll get the first vote. So that'll be important too to talk about a little bit. So this is the structure of the articles. What I'd like to do is quickly go through what's common between these two approaches. And as I said, much is in common. And I'm going to run through these pretty quickly, but these are the types of things that you want to understand would be the regulations for short-term rentals. The first important thing to know is that an operator must own the unit, and the unit must be the operator's primary residence. This is an important component, probably for me, one of the most important components to protect the long-term housing inventory of Brookline. This is what will keep investors, LLCs and others to be able to come in, which there's many in Brookline right now, that they buy units and then they operate them as short-term rentals. It's imperative, given the housing shortage in Brookline, that we protect our long-term housing. The second is that an operator must have a valid certificate of operation. It's kind of like a license, but it's not formally a license. It'll be issued by the select board. The operators need to have information posted for guests relating to parking regulations and trash disposal and recycling and noise ordinances, that type of information. The rental period for a short-term rental is between 24 hours and 27 days. After 27 days, that would be considered a long-term rental, like a month-to-month lease or a year-long lease. The select board in these regulations do have the ability to issue additional regulations for implementation. We don't have all the details figured out, but most of them in the bylaws. There is a provision, the articles for transparency, and articles, each certificate that's been issued will be published to the website, to the town's website. So if you want to understand where a short-term rental is, or you're interested in buying a property or renting a condo or something, you can find out if there's a short-term rental nearby or in the building that you're going to be moving into. There is a provision to revoke. It's called the 3 strikes and you're out clause. If an operator receives 3 violations within a 12-month period, their certificate would be revoked, and they would be able to get it reestablished, but they would need to go before the select board for a public hearing. Importantly, select board short-term rentals are allowed in all zoning districts. This is important. This means that every street, every precinct, every neighborhood has the potential to host short-term rentals. Commercial uses are prohibited, so there can't be any pop-up activities, or short-term rentals can't be used for a wedding venue. As I mentioned, the articles do define the enforcement agencies. It's the building commissioner, it's the police commissioner, it's the health inspectors, etc. And then the two articles have a common set of fines, and it's an escalating fine structure from $100 to $300 for your first, second, or third offense. So that's, in essence, what's common between the two. And these things are pretty dense. There's a lot more stuff in there, but these are the most important things, provisions that I think people would be interested in. This is what's different, and this is really important between Article 15 and Article 17. The first is with respect to the number of guests. And I'd like to say that this from the Moderators Committee and Advisory, we took the building commissioner's advice very seriously, which is to start slow and not go too fast. And the reason why is if we're too expansive in the beginning and we find that it's overwhelming, it's very difficult to take something away from somebody that you've granted them. So the approach of the Moderators Committee and the Advisory Committee is kind of a go slow, let's see how it goes, and then expand. So that approach, the first is in Article 15, the restriction on the number of guests that an operator can have in their unit at one time as a short-term rental is 4 guests in a multi-unit dwelling, so that would be like a condo building, or 6 guests in a single unit dwelling, which would be a single family home. In Article 17, the petitioners have expanded that, and they're offering up to 9 guests if the operator is not present during the rental, and up to 6 guests if the operator is present during the rental. Significant expansion on the number of guests. Rental days is another important component. So this is how many days that an operator can rent out their short-term rental rooms or entire unit. The Article 15, which is the Moderator Committee, and again, the Advisory Committee's recommendation is that it's a total of 90 days in a calendar year. But importantly, the Select Board can modify this. So if they see that things are going well, they could expand it over time, and maybe they make it 100, maybe they make it 120, and they incrementally increase it. Article 17 has 90 days in a calendar year if the operator is not present. So remember, you don't have to be present for a short-term rental. However, if the operator is present, the Article 17 allows for 180 days. So that's 6 months in a calendar year. And importantly, the Select Board cannot modify this. This would be locked in. This next provision is one of the most controversial provisions in all the articles. And I'm going to try to explain this in another slide. But it's the condo provision. And essentially the differences are in Article 15, the condominium association must expressly permit the short-term rental. They either, and this is very important. This is called the Pelkey motion. You'll start hearing about the Pelkey-Karen motion. And the Advisory Committee adopted and is recommending the Pelkey-Karen motion. So as I said, the condominium association must expressly permit the short-term rental. Article 17 has a very different view about this. Their view is that the condominium association must not prohibit the short-term rental. It's very different language. Most condominiums don't exclude short-term rentals because they wrote their bylaws long before short-term rentals were thought of. And I'm going to explain this in another slide in a minute. Inspections, Article 15 requires that a safety inspection, a fire inspection, a health inspection is done prior to the short-term rental being allowed to operate. Article 17 makes that not required, it's optional. Abutters, Article 15 requires that the town notify immediate abutters within 15 days that a short-term rental operation certificate has been issued. We think that's very important for transparency. Article 17 says that the notice requirements can be determined by the Select Board at a future date. And as Neil Wyshynski, the former chair of the Select Board, who's also part of the Advisory Committee that evaluated these articles, said, if you leave it to the Select Board, it's essentially optional. So that's important to notice. And then the last thing that's very different is violations. Again, we wanted to build transparency into these articles. The Moderators Committee, the Advisory Committee has built into their Article 15 that the town must publish short-term rental violations on the website. A number of communities around us do this, and we wanted to replicate that. We think it's important. And Article 17 deletes this provision. So these are the differences. There's 6 differences, but they're really important. And there's 2 that I want to dig into a little bit more because they're really important. My friend Roger Blood, who is the chair of the Housing Advisory Board, and that's very concerned about affordable housing. They oversee affordable housing in Brookline. Presented a slide very similar to this to the advisory committee. And I thought it really was helpful for people to understand what it means when we start changing the number of days that someone can rent out a room in Brookline. So according to Roger, the most affordable housing unit in Brookline is that single bedroom in a home or a condo that's rented out long-term to someone that can't afford a full apartment or buy a house or a condo. So this little chart here shows a very simple analysis. It's just for one room. This is the single room annual revenue potential for one bedroom in Brookline. For a long-term rental of a bedroom, assuming $1,000 a month, Roger says that's a reasonable number, you would expect the annual revenue for that homeowner, that operator, would be $12,000 just for that one bedroom. If you offer short-term rentals for a cap of 90 days, and you assume $100 a night, which is a good number, it's a good average number to use for a short-term rental for one bedroom, not guest, but one bedroom, that would be $9,000 a year in revenue. So, you know, you can see $12,000 for a long-term rental or $9,000. There's not a real incentive to convert that long-term bedroom, at least revenue-wise, into a short-term rental. But when you go to 180 days, which is what the Article 17 is doing, which is very important. I think I covered that. Is very important. Suddenly, the revenue jumps to $18,000 a year. And the house, Roger, as the chair of the Housing Advisory Board, is very concerned, as well as the advisory committee and the moderators committee, that if we make short-term rentals too lucrative, we will lose some of the affordable units, specifically those bedrooms within Brookline. So Article 15 has 90 days as the maximum, and Article 17 allows up to 180 days for a short-term rental. So this is really important. This is my simple approach to the condominium provision. I'm sorry for the kooky drawing, but I did do this at like 4 o'clock this morning because I had an aha moment to try to explain this. This is the difference between Article 15 and Article 17. Now, this is very simple. This is a 2-unit association. There's a lot of people that live in 2-unit condo associations in Brookline. A lot of big homes have been converted into 2 units. On the left is Article 15's condo provision. If both owners say yes, we can have short-term rentals, the short-term rentals will be allowed by Brookline. Article 17 very simply says, if one owner says yes and the other says no, Brookline would still allow it. This is a really, really important point. And I would encourage anybody who has access to Facebook or the Town Meeting Member Association website. Linda Pelkey and John Caron have wrote extensively about this the other day. When you get into larger associations, 3, 4, 5, even larger ones, you start to get into the 75% threshold in order to have a provision, a change in a bylaw. But this is essentially the issue. You're either giving a by right on the right, which is 17, it's the default, even though maybe the majority of owners don't want it. They would be, that short-term rentals would be thrust upon them as a new use without any say. But on the left, which is Articles 15 position, the Moderators Committee's position, the Advisory Committee's permission, which is you need to have explicit consent from the condominium before short-term rentals are allowed. This is probably the biggest difference between these 2 articles. So I've shown you the structure of the articles, 14 and 16. We've got Articles 17 and 15 as competing articles, where much is the same, but there are 6 important differences. What if? This is interesting. You know, at town meeting, there's two components to the articles. There's a general bylaw, which requires a 50% plus one majority. And then there's a zoning change, which is Article 14, which requires a 2/3 vote. It is possible that town meeting will not agree at a supermajority level to allow short-term rentals. So if nothing passes, if we can't get the zoning bylaw changed because we can't agree between 15 and 17 or other amendments that come, what do we do then? Now, remember, I told you earlier that there's a lawsuit pending that states that's saying that the town is not interpreting its bylaw correctly, and that short-term rentals should be legal because it's not defined. So if we do not have some definition of short-term rental in the zoning, either allowing it or not allowing it, and that lawsuit prevails, short-term rentals will become a by right use in Brookline, which means that anybody can do it. There'll be no regulations, there'll be no restrictions, and there'll be nothing to enforce other than our normal health and safety rules. This is really critical because if that happens, and 2 years from now, if we decide that we can finally figure out how to agree on short-term rentals and we pass regulations, all the short-term rentals that are in place up to that date will most likely be grandfathered in as a non-conforming use. That would be devastating to our long-term housing because it wouldn't stop investors from buying up units and renting them out as short-term rentals. So there's a alternate motion. It's called contingent motion Article 14. And essentially what it does is it defines a short-term rental, and then it says it can't be done anywhere in Brookline. This is the backstop for town meeting should we not be able to agree on short-term rentals. So with that, in conclusion, there's some important questions to ask that we've considered as the Moderators Committee, that the Advisory Committee has been doing, and many residents, which I think Betsy raised some of them at the beginning. What is fair and reasonable? What's fair and reasonable for short-term rentals? For those that need income to be able to maintain affordability in Brookline, and for those who want to live a quiet, enjoyable life in their condo or their neighborhood, what is fair and reasonable? What is the impact of the availability and cost on long-term housing of short-term rentals? How many units get converted from long-term rentals to short-term rentals? It's an important question to ask. What's the potential impact on residents and neighborhoods? Is there disruptions? Or is there not even a problem? This is an important question to ask ourselves. Very important. Can these regulations be enforced? How, under Article 17, how do you know if you get more days if you're present and you get more days if you're not present and less days if you're present? How do you enforce that? Is there a bedroom check? Does someone check to see if the owner's in the bedroom? These things are very difficult to enforce. We have to think about that. And then, as I said, most importantly, what's the impact on Brookline if no regulations are passed? We will be in deep doo-doo if we do not pass something. So given that lawsuit, it's really important. So with that, the advisory committee recommendations are the following. Advisory positive actions, for those that don't know the language, basically they're recommending that you vote this way at town meeting. Article 14 as amended. Article 15 as amended. Article 16 has not been changed at all. Those are the enforcement regulations. And then advisory is recommending positive action on Article 14, the contingent motion, only if we need it. They're recommending that something be in place. And advisory committee has voted no action on Article 17. They're saying no, it's way too permissive. Now's not the time. The planning board last night has voted positive action on the Pelkey-Karen motion, which is that amendment that has to do with condo associations. So with that, I thank you for your indulgence of your time, and I'm happy to take your questions.
I think, given that these two items are so closely related, and I don't see any questions in the chat, and I'm sorry, I should have said at the beginning, if you have questions, please use the chat, which is at the bottom of the Zoom window. I'm going to recommend that we go ahead and take up Article 17. Maureen, are you ready to speak? And I understand you had some slides, and my question is, are we set up to use your slides, Maureen? You'll have to unmute yourself, please.
Of course. I'm going to try to share my screen, and I'm going to fingers that it works.
Good. And we'll let Maureen complete her presentation, and then we'll have slides on the whole question of short-term rentals. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Thanks. Okay, Maureen, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Share screen. Okay, does anyone know, can you see my screen?
We can see it, but we can only see.
Can you see that now?
Wait a minute, it's getting better.
Ah,
there we go.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you. I want to say thank you to the League of Women Voters and Betsy and Ernie for giving me this opportunity. And also thank you, Paul, for your very thorough presentation and all the work that you've put into this. And thank you for all of you who are in the chat room and observing and taking an interest. These are very complicated warrant articles. There are admittedly an awful lot to unpack with these warrant articles. And admittedly, I'm not as good with my slideshows. I'm not a member of advisory committee as Paul is. I'm not even a town meeting member. But
it's okay. You're a citizen of the town and you have the floor.
Town government, correct. Thank you, Betsy. But I was a member, I am a member of the Moderators Committee on Short-Term Rentals. And I'm also the co-petitioner of Warrant Article 17. And I think, so I'm going to attempt to just answer why did I submit Warrant Article 17 if I was on the Moderators Committee. And I'm also just going to take a step back and say Paul was very thorough, and I'm not going to get into a lot of the weeds. I want to paint a big picture summary because a lot of people are just learning about these warrant articles and even what SDRs are. Warrant Article 15 is very good. And Warrant Article 15 did a very good job of protecting the town of Brookline from what we would call bad STRs. But I believe it went too far in its restrictions and it's punitive to homeowners of Brookline. And I felt that the part of the charge of the Moderators Committee was to be as expansive as we could to allow for a broader dialogue. So Warrant Article 17 was intended to protect homeowners' rights while still, or continue to protect the town's rights, continue to keep the protections for the town in place, but put back in some of the homeowners' rights that we felt had been sort of stripped away. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought a little bit there. And we also did it to expand the dialogue. We felt that, you know, we have to talk with the advisory committee, the select board, receive a lot of public comments, you know, debate this on town meeting. We wanted a broader dialogue for these regulations so that more people could weigh in. There were 6 people on the Moderators Committee for short-term rentals. Personally, I don't think that's enough people in the conversation. I wanted more people in the conversation. I'm personally in conversation with at least 20 STR operators in Brookline, homeowners, and I feel that their interest had not been considered. So Warrant Article 17 intended to be more flexible and broaden the conversation. And in fact, since we've submitted our petition, there's been a pretty exhaustive amendment called the Dempsey Amendment to Warrant Article 17, which myself and my co-petitioner, Susie Roberts, support. So Warrant Article 17 has already made quite a few compromises. And to Paul's point, he's correct. There's a handful of fundamental differences. And I think it's helpful to try to illuminate what those are. I won't spend a lot of time on this because Paul went over it. but it can't be said enough times. Both warrant articles 15 and 17 prohibit commercial use in short-term rentals. And by the way, an STR is not a commercial use. It's a residential use. It's not a commercial use. It's not a business use. So both articles prohibit commercial use in short-term rentals. They prohibit investor units, and they prohibit professionally managed units. I'm going to take a minute to talk about, say something about that, which is that there are very few complaints in town about STRs, and the ones that do largely exist in clusters of investor unit buildings. And I don't think anyone in this conversation thinks that those violations are okay. The Moderators Committee and the co-petitioners of Warrant 17 are in complete agreement that that the town needs to address the units that are prohibited, and neither article would allow for that. They both obviously prohibit rentals of less than 24 hours. They both enable the select board to issue further regulations, like eventually deciding to put a cap on the number of STR units townwide. They both provide for an appeals procedure, and both would go into effect January 1st, 2022. Both also require that any short-term rental be a primary residence of the operator. And both articles have adopted the exact same language per the advisory committee with regard to the proving primary. It's a very high bar for proving primary residence. Primary residence means you occupy your home for at least 183 days per year. So they are identical in that way. I also want to point out that both Article 15 and 17 are much stricter than a lot of our neighboring communities. Both 17 and 15 require that the operator of a short-term rental be the owner of the unit, and they prohibit STR rentals in rented homes. You know, that one's tricky because it is potentially an equity issue, that why can't someone who rents an apartment also earn income with an empty room? And I'm sympathetic to that, and I'd like, maybe someday there'll be a creative answer to that. But at the moment, there doesn't appear to be any way to close the loophole of investor units. And that is why that restriction is in there, because allowing renters to operate an STR allows for an investor unit to put a pretend tenant in, but actually functionally be just an STR. But I do want to say that I'm sympathetic to legitimate residents, legitimate renters in Brookline. And there are some who, the way that they afford to pay the rent, they've experienced increased rent, or they've experienced a loss of income, but they're in the community. They work here, they live here, they're on committees, and a way that they've been able to afford to be able to stay is to sometimes rent a spare room, either year round while they're there, or occasionally rent a room if they go away for a weekend. Both warrant articles require that operators attain a certificate for STR. Both require that short-term rentals provide guest information about parking, trash, recycling. And I also want to just say, because I don't think it's said a lot, because what's been missing in this conversation is the perspective of the STR operator in Brookline. And I want to be emphatic here. These are longtime Brookline residents. I know of two that have lived in Brookline since the 70s. They're elder women, and they are responsible and conscientious, and they host people in spare rooms in their home, and they do it beautifully. And these are their primary residents, and they are not going to do anything to jeopardize their home or their neighborhood. So what I'm trying to say is a lot of the conversation about short-term rentals paints a picture of the short-term guest, paints a picture of the short-term operator as potentially, a bad actor. And that's not who these people are. These are people with families, whose families have grown up, whose spouses have passed away, the majority of women, single women, 65 years or older in Brookline earn $30,000 or less. Are we really okay with making them have to leave town because their incomes are not high enough?
Can I ask you to move to what are the differences between the
Sure.
two sets of articles? Because I think we sort of covered this already. And you
Okay, I'm just going to use.
want to use your time to explain what is different.
Okay. So and Paul is right. There's just a handful of things that are really different. And a big difference is occupancy limits. So so this is the Dempsey amendment to Warrant Article 17, which the petitioners have supported. I have to move my screen a little bit. Can't read my own slide because of the pictures. So Warrant Article 17, or the Dempsey Motion, allows for the rental of 2 people per bedrooms when you are renting your whole unit. And I'm just going to take a minute to explain, because this is also a basic terminology for STRs. There's a whole unit, which means you go away for a week and you let someone else come in and occupy your home. Or there's what's called a room share, which is you live there, you go about your business, you go to work, but you have spare bedrooms and you have guests who are in those bedrooms. And those are the 2 types that are allowed in these warrant articles. There are other types that exist in other communities, and we have, like owner adjacent, we have not allowed that. Warrant Article 15 is limiting the guests to 6 guests in a single family and 4 guests in a multifamily. And Warrant Article 17 is allowing for 2 people per bedroom for the whole unit. So if you have a 2-bedroom condo or house, that means 4 people. If you have a 3-bedroom house or condo, that means 6 people. And why we put that in there, some people say, well, 9 sounds like a lot of people, or 7 sounds like a lot of people. That is essentially so that a family could come to Brookline and stay in an STR. 2 parents, 3 kids, 2 parents, 2 people, families come to Brookline and need to stay in an SDR to visit their family who live in Brookline, to attend graduations, to do many things in Brookline. So we felt it was important to retain that ability. The room allowance, if you are if it's a room share and you're occupying your place at the same time, the guest limit is 6. So primary residence is the same. The condo association, we're talking about 2 different sides. I think both the Pelkey Amendment and Warrant Article 15 and the Dempsey Amendment are suggesting that the town should not get overly involved in how condo associations do their business. And most of us agree that condo associations are silent on STR language. STR language is new language, so it is true that most condo associations are silent on it. Warrant Article 17 and the Dempsey Amendment feels that absolutely, if a condo association wishes to decide in whatever manner they do conduct their business, if they wish to vote that STRs are prohibited, they should have that right, and that should be honored, absolutely. But if the condo association has not collectively made a decision, then the default should be that a condo owner has all the same rights as another homeowner. That's really what it comes down to for us. We are not trying to get around any condo association prohibitions. We feel the language that is being proposed by Article 15 and the Pelkey Amendment would essentially ban all condos from ever being allowed, or any condo from ever being allowed to be an SDR, because you just wouldn't, because of the language of that it expressly allows for it. And since so many condo associations are actually silent on it, that's essentially a ban on SDRs in any condo. And we feel that the regulations we have in place are already sufficiently strict that in the case where an SDR would be in a condo, there's enough protections for the condo association and the larger neighborhood that it would not be a hardship for the other condos or the neighborhood. The notifications, are essentially the same. I think in one, the select board does it, and the other, the town sends out notification of abutters that an STR is registered. We've kept the same about 3 strikes, revocation. Inspections, I want to also say that we hear the language a lot that Warrant Article 17 wants to make inspections an exception, optional. That's not quite the language that I would use. We simply change the language from a unit shall be inspected before certification to a unit may be inspected before certification. And that is solely to give flexibility to the town with regard to how and when and to what extent they want to conduct their inspections. We are pro inspection, but we do not want it to be overly burdened for the town. And we do not want an inability to do timely inspections to unduly penalize homeowners in Brookline. Days per year. The Dempsey Amendment is proposing 90 days per year for a full unit. So those times that you leave and you let someone occupy your whole house for 3 days or 7 days, that you can do that 90 days in a year. And that when you are renting a room within your home, that it's 180 days. And I want to take a second to talk about why we're pushing for 180 days, whereas the Warrant Article 15 is 90 days for both. STRs technically are prohibited as of December 2018 per Dan Bennett. But prior to that, Use 51 was silent on length of stay for rental in Brookline. So I want to be really clear. Rentals for less than 30 days were not prohibited in Brookline ever prior to December 2018. So this is something that people were legally allowed to do. And it is something that people have been doing. They've been doing it for decades. So when the Warrant Article 15 people say, well, let's start small, let's just, do baby steps. This Warrant Article 15 restrictions are not starting small. They're taking away rights of Brookline homeowners that they have had for decades, for a very long time. So in fact, prior to Dan Bennett's proclamation in December 2018, a homeowner could rent for a room in their house for short term for 365 days a year. So we're having that. The Warrant Article 17 is already taking away half of those days. We feel like 180 days is a reasonable compromise to address the broad concerns and protect homeowners' rights. Both articles adopt fire alarm language recommended by the fire chief. The regulations are the same. It looks like Warrant Article 15 adopted. Warrant Article 15's language originally was $300 per violation. Warrant Article 17, the Dempsey Motion, is the fines are $100 for your first one, this $200 for your second, and $300 for your third. And any reporting, meaning for violations, is 17 has adopted Warrant Articles 15 language. So Warrant Article, the Dempsey Motion, supported by the petitioners of Warrant Article 17, started out more flexible and expansive with the intention to have a broader dialogue. We are maybe 3/4 of the way through that broader dialogue. And as a result of that broader dialogue, we have in fact made compromises. And we feel that this hits the sweet spot of absolutely keeping all of the same protections for the town and neighbors, but puts back in some of the long-held rights of Brookline homeowners. And I also just want to very briefly say that I really appreciated Paul's slides. They were thorough and very clear. But when his slide was what is reasonable, homeowners' rights isn't on that slide. What is reasonable to do for all of our citizens of Brookline? And there's a lot of stakeholders here, and the people who are living here a long time and who need additional income, need to be a considered stakeholder. And we think we've been able to address their needs without taking away any townwide protections. And on that, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maureen. I think we have now certainly seen the complexity of this series of warrant articles. I don't have any direct questions in the chat. And therefore, I think rather than, I mean, if somebody in the audience would like to raise your hand, and to do that, you have to click on the little hand raise thing, which I actually don't see at the moment. We could take a couple.
It's in reactions now.
Then we'd have to move on to our next item. So if you're if you have a question, do I see anything? Okay, Don Lecca, I've got a hand up. You can unmute and speak.
Thank you so much. I left this question on the moderator's chat. At any rate, I was curious. I wanted to ask about the mechanisms for amending the regulations. I think this is going to be an experiment, and I want to see how flexible we can be in adjusting to this new regime.
Okay, I'm going to ask Paul to answer that one if he can.
Thank you, Don. That's actually a great question. So there's two aspects of the regulation structure that allows for modification. There's first, it's most of the regulations, if not almost all of them, are in the general bylaw, which means that you just need a simple majority at town meeting to make a change of the regulations. So if we decide we want to expand something, allow investors, except these things can be done at the general bylaw or increase the number of days. There's also two provisions within control of the select board. The select board has the ability to develop additional regulations for implementation. So anything that's not specifically, they couldn't change, for example, the number of guests, because that's defined in the bylaw. However, they could change the number of days. As I mentioned earlier, the Article 15 proposes 90 days as a cap, but allows the select board to increase that. So they could increase it to 180 if they wanted to, if they find that 90 is working okay. And then I think the other important point is that these regulations can certainly interface with lodging house regulations. That's a little bit of a complexity that we didn't talk about, because there is a state law that actually limits the number of people you can have in your home to 3. And our regulations don't deal with that at the lodging house level. So the select board can also adjust that to help make these things work. So to answer a simple question, the select board has the ability to make some adjustments on the number of days and also promulgate regulations for implementation, and also town meeting, because the bulk of the regulations are in the general bylaw. It takes a simple majority to change.
Okay, and now just so to be clear, if you raise your hand, you look at the bottom of the screen where it says reactions, and then there's a little place where you can click on a raised hand, and then we've got about 3 more minutes for this before we move on to our next item. Any more questions? Do I see any raised hands?
Can I just, if no one else has a question, can I
Yeah,
just?
I will give you that in just a second, Maureen. I want to just,
No, about the question that was just
now, this is question time, and I want to make sure we have it.
Betsy, there was a question in the chat that I answered, which an individual had asked, does the select board have the ability to place a cap on the number of certificates issued? And in fact, they do. The select board has the ability to cap the number of certificates issued if they find that there are too many issued at a certain time.
Okay, and I think what the general response to this must be that the select board would be the authority to which future questions would be raised, and they may have the authority to implement them, or it may have to go back to town meeting. Maureen, you have the floor.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to add to what Paul said. Both warrant articles equally give the select board equal power to promulgate on these regulations. So they're the same in that way. It was unclear with Warrant Article 15 if select board could expand the number of days, which is why we put in 180 days. And just really briefly, this lodging house language has entered the conversation recently, and there are some key distinctions. A lodging house, an STR has to be a primary resident, owner occupied, which is not the case for a lodging house. There's many more regulations with regard to lodging house, and none of the surrounding communities interpret STR language regard to use lodging house law statutes to regulate STRs. They're really separate entities with separate regulations. So I think that's confusing the conversation and is not appropriate. I'm not appropriate, but lodging houses, STRs are not lodging houses.
Right, and just for the record, lodging houses are separately regulated.
Yes.
They have a series of requirements that are different from STRs, and those regulations have been in place for many, many years in Brookline. So although there may be some comparable components of the two, they aren't identical. And the issue of residency, there are other things that are not the same.
Zoning, yes, there are, that's right.
So anyway, I don't see any more questions, and therefore I'm going to make one last request. If you have a question, please click on reaction and hit that little raised hand, or if you like, and you're on my screen, I can try to, oh, there we go. Susan Daly has a question. You can.
She's asking about, she's going to ask it live. Great.
She's asking.
Thank you, Betsy. I did type it in the chat, but I didn't know if you had seen it. So the petitioners could either read that question or just respond. The motivation, if the complaints have been relatively minor or infrequent, I'm just wondering the main motivation behind such what seem to be pretty heavy-handed regulations, particularly from 15. Thanks.
So that's a great question. I think there's two parts to what I think Susan is asking. One is, do we even need regulations since there haven't been any complaints? First, we've looked at and asked extensively about complaints. The town doesn't track any complaints. They don't have the provision for it. They don't have the system for it. If you call the police department, which a member of the Moderators Committee, Anna Albuquerque, who's also a precinct 1 town meeting member, called to ask, they don't track any complaints. They can't tell you if it's a short-term rental or not. She did do some analysis to compare the number of complaints that aren't specific to locations of short-term rentals, and there is a correlation. But because nothing is tracked, we just don't know, and there's no data, so you really can't draw any conclusions. We do know that the building commissioner has shut down a number of short-term rentals due to complaints. So we do know that for a fact. But the building inspector anecdotally said the majority of the complaints that he gets are from multi-unit buildings, from condos and apartments. And that's, that has been a specific issue that we heard over and over and over again from public comment at both the last year with the advisory committee and the select board, and also at the moderators committee. People are very concerned about and have experienced significant issues with noise and parking and trash in multi-unit buildings. So, to answer your question, Susan, there's just no real data on it, but certainly the problems do exist.
And why does it not work for the building inspector just to close down that operation? That seems like that might be working.
So I'm not sure I'm understanding. Are you suggesting that there shouldn't be regulations?
Well, I'm trying to find out if there's a need, if we have a system that seems to be working when complaints can shut down the,
Maybe short-term rentals here is the regulations haven't been implemented yet.
So today they're illegal. you can't operate a short-term rental. So it's
This framework we're discussing has yet to be adopted.
right.
And therefore,
Can I-
in
yeah.
effect, the environment is very the regulations that are available are very limited.
Could I have a shot at answering this as well? I'll be brief. I think most people agree that we need regulations, and what prompted STR regulations in Brookline were not problem STRs. What prompted it was Massachusetts passing state regulations on STRs and collecting a 6% tax fee per night and sending that fee to Brookline. So in, I think it was 2019 fiscal year, Brookline earned $435,000 in nightly fees from the state. And the planning department said, well, this is awkward to collect our revenue from something that in which we are silent. So, and it's, Airbnb is popular and everyone is adopting regulations. It is absolutely appropriate to have regulations to protect everyone. And also because STR operators want to be compliant with the law. The gray area that has existed since December 2018 has been uncomfortable for everyone. So the regulations are necessary. And with regard to tracking, I'm not really sure that I agree with that. There isn't a tracking system for STRs because STRs don't supposedly exist in Brookline. So you can't look up complaints or violations for STRs, but you can generally look up complaints and violations and compare and contrast with addresses. And the planning department, in their draft in 2020, they looked at 5 years worth of complaints, and there were approximately 30 complaints, not violations, complaints. Some of them were inquiries, some of them were, well, anyway, there was 30 of them, and over a 5-year period. So that's the best data that we have on that.
Thank you, Maureen. I think we do have to move on. I'm going to say there's one question in the chat, which was, is the revenue from STRs taxed? And the answer is properly reported, absolutely. And it would be treated the same as other income, depending on the status of the owner of the property. And I'm not going to go into the details of this, but revenues from that would be treated as income and therefore subject to taxation.
Well, actually, Betsy, the short-term rentals are taxed at the lodging rate. So they're treated just like a hotel. So that's how they're treated. So I think it's 6% that we get. It's actually a commercial tax. So the idea that this is not a commercial activity, the state thinks it's a commercial activity and they tax it at a commercial rate.
Right, but
I think we're talking about, the question was, are STRs taxed? And it's up to the homeowner to pay their appropriate income taxes, and that's
Right.
not a commercial rate. And yes, Massachusetts collects a 6% tax per night, and that is sent to Brookline. So it's actually a revenue stream for Brookline.
right. So I'm sorry, there is a distinction. There's the state imposed tax that is separate from reporting personal income. Okay, so there's two different ways for this revenue to be reported.
Right.
And I assume, given that the state's extracting 6%, the total that gets reported on the personal taxes is minus the 6% that goes to the state of Massachusetts. But I don't know about that. Anyway, thank you both. This has been very helpful. We will all agree that there's lots to be thought about here and more to come. And I'm sure that the debate at town meeting will also address many of these questions and maybe answer some of them. And depending on what gets passed, we're then going to begin to develop a history that might very well be something that we can, as a league, look at and try to understand what the impact has been, if that turns out to be useful in the end. But we thank you both. And we do recognize that this is a set of new regulations that present many, many questions, and some of them still have to be answered. So we're going to move on now. Our final warrant articles is from the warrant article number 35, way back at the end of the town meeting list. And it is one which has special significance to the League of Women Voters because it addresses, let's call it voter access in a broad sense, making it easier for people to vote by mail, to register to vote, and to become engaged, active members of the community. And I will invite Kate Silbaugh, who has already shared her screen. Good for you, Kate, to move up and take over and explain to us the issues in Article 35. Well, take over, Kate, wherever you are.
Okay, thank you, Betsy, and thank you, League of Women Voters. You guys can hear me all right?
Yep.
Yes? Yeah. Okay, so this is a fairly simple resolution. And for those who are
listening to, it's no big deal, huh?
well,
Sorry.
yes, compared to what we've been listening to, I just want to explain that the difference between resolutions and bylaws, which most warrant articles are bylaws, is this doesn't really become a part of the law of the town, but resolutions are taken pretty seriously by town departments. So I'm not trying to minimize the fact that the resolution matters, but just so you understand, it is a resolution, it does not become a bylaw.
Well, and
So
I should say in Brookline, Kate, resolutions usually get treated with the same level as a bylaw.
yes, absolutely, absolutely, unless they conflict with state law or something like this. Okay, so it is a resolution to increase voting, and I just want to explain why we came about this resolution. Right here, you see the 351 municipalities in the state of Massachusetts. And this is registered voter turnout. This is not a matter of who's not registered, because in Brookline, we often say, well, it's because non-citizens or something like this. Where we come out in this is at 276. This is in terms of the turnout of registered voters in Brookline. And this was not the municipal election. This was in the 2020 presidential. Okay, so that's an election that was a high interest election. And we were one of the worst in the states in terms of registered voter turnout for that election. And I know that comes as a great surprise to everyone, but that's the truth. Then we turn to municipal elections. And if you just look at this, you see a comparison between us and it's a little hard to pull this data for some jurisdictions, but this is just a few comparators of ours. We are the yellow here. We're not always the worst. Occasionally there's one or two that are worse than we are, but we're nowhere near the top in terms of turnout for municipal elections. And I think our reason for this, we think this warrant article has a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is that Brookline is 50% renters, and nationally, renters don't vote at the same rate as homeowners. So if you see nationally, 52% of homeowners vote and 29% of renters vote, and then you come over and you see that Brookline's got a lot of renters relative to homeowners, and you might have the beginning of an explanation for why our turnout is so low. So the heart of the whereas clause here is that we're getting a new town clerk. And we want as town meeting to communicate to the town clerk that this is something we're energized around, that we as town meeting would like the town clerk to be proactive in this regard. So consider novel means of increasing access. Now, it does have, the resolution does have a few specific requests. Those are that we have voter registration materials in our public buildings, the police station, Brookline High School, the schools, in public housing, in libraries, and at the fire station. So these are public buildings that people might walk into, and that at the front, there is voter registration materials available. This both increases access to voter registration materials, and it also communicates the town's commitment to voting. So by repetition and by seeing those forms, you can see the town's commitment to voting. The town sends out an annual town census, and the resolution asks that we include voter registration materials with that town census. And it asks that in these same public buildings, although it could be behind plexiglass or upon request, absentee ballot applications that have those sort of pre-stamped things that the town only has to pay if a person actually uses it. And then we would like the town to have ample multilingual materials at all voter registration sites, including online and also at polling stations. And it will be up to the town clerk to figure out which languages are appropriate for Brookline. But this is, again, part of being proactive. We want the town already puts out those great sandwich boards, but we would like them to use robocalls and social media to remind people that it's election day, cast your ballots. And then finally, we're asking the town to do a geospatial voter registration study, which sounds, complex, but it's actually just, it's the kind of thing that I say people in Brookline make these kinds of maps when they're just trying to win an argument on Facebook. So all you have to do is look at who's voting, who's registered, and then put that over a population map. And we think a graduate student could probably do this in 40 hours or less. So it's a couple $1,000s. And it would just tell you where we're under registered and then where our registered voters are under voting relative to the population. And that would be a start for letting the town figure out what to do about it. Again, just to finish, this is town meetings guidance for the new town clerk as to our vision as a town and our goals for proactive approach to voter access. There are timelines built into this, given that the town clerk will be new. So it's, the most of the stuff is implementation in spring of 2022. That's it.
Okay, I would like to know if you have some additional information. Like, for example, I understand that at the state there is legislation being discussed about permitting mail-in voting as a permanent, as opposed to the former version, the one that's easier of access. Do you have any current information about the status of that?
So I think the simplest answer would be to say no. I am not the lead petitioner on this. I'm the secondary petitioner, but the lead petitioner is not here today. He's been tracking it, but I think it's one of those things that everybody agrees is going to happen, but I can't speak to the final form. Right. We felt that was part of why we wanted it to be a resolution, because obviously if the state overrides something or, but we don't, the actual must-dos here are pretty modest. It's an expression that we want the town to get out there, make voter registration materials visible. Those are really the big things. And then study why we have a participation issue and act on it however they feel it's appropriate.
Okay, and I'll just say that we hope, the League hopes, that Massachusetts legislature will be making mail-in voting easier and regular and legal going forward. We've been monitoring it. I know it hasn't been passed yet, but we certainly would contribute to making the resolution here, or it would support that resolution, I guess is what I'm going to say. And then one other observation I will share as a former member or a member of the town's Census Complete Count Committee. We learned that there is a very substantial portion of Brookline residents who are enrolled in local colleges and universities. And in order for us to really count all those bodies who may often be renters, sometimes the school itself owns property where they live. The local Boston University, Northeastern, and Boston College all contributed to our census the number of students who were, quote, Brookline residents, who probably don't vote here. They're permitted to if they register, but they don't have to. And so that adds another sort of question mark in terms of how this all gets played out and when you're calculating votes or the percentage of participants.
Absolutely.
The factor, that's all. Anyway.
Absolutely. And I just want to say, because someone asked, Don Lecca asked, is registration the issue or is turnout the issue? And we hope the study, just the GIS study, which is a fairly simple thing to do, will produce an answer to that question. Right. But very puzzling is that we had low registered voter turnout in the presidential. And, so students, they can register here or not register here, but if they're registered and not voting, oh dear, that's an issue.
Sure, absolutely. And I will say, in last year and all of the years before, the league in particular would be at the high school registering students as early as possible for at least 2 or 3 different sessions during the school year. And of course, we haven't had the opportunity to do that, which is simply to say it has nothing to do with what Kate's talking about, a very important piece of information, that the actual registered voter turnout is not as high as one would wish, in spite of the fact that there's regularly effort to get people registered to vote. So it's really going to the polls, doing vote by mail, all of the other possible ways people can do it that we want to encourage. Anyway, okay. I'm looking to see if there are any more questions, and mostly they seem to be related to short-term rentals. So anybody?
I should just add that you would think this wouldn't be controversial, but we failed to get select board or AC support for it. We got AC subcommittee and CDICR support for it. So
Curious. Okay. Questions from our audience present? Anybody want to raise your hand and ask a question? You have to either wiggle it in visibility or do the Zoom hand raise. And I don't see any at the moment. So someone has asked in the chat, and perhaps Kate, you know, was there a cost involved in doing this that seemed to be a barrier?
I don't think that's the barrier. I mean, the main cost is that, you know, it is the study, which we think is going to be a couple $1,000s. So that's the main cost. I mean, there is a cost if you do go to the fire station and get your absentee ballot application form there, the town would be paying that postage. But the number of people who are going to do that versus apply from home just to save a stamp, we think is pretty small. And I suppose the printing of voter registration forms, but those are, I mean, you know, you don't get to decide not to spend on running an election. So voter registration is part of running an election.
Okay, well, I again don't see any additional questions on this topic. And unless folks who have joined us in person want to raise their hand, I thank you very much, Kate, for your presentation. And I hope people will pay close attention to this one at town meeting, and that the questions that have been raised, to the extent that they can be answered, are going to be possible. But I would say, without having the opportunity to study this and take a lead position as we would have to do, the League certainly is very much in support of efforts to increase voter participation at all levels. We believe it's in everybody's interest for everyone to vote, obviously. So thank you very much for putting this forward. And with that, I will thank everyone for being with us this morning. Just to let you know, the program was recorded, and we hope as soon as possible, maybe in a day or two, it will be available on public access television, BIG. And we hope that the other people who haven't had a chance to be with us this morning will have a chance to join us then. But I thank you all for being with us, and we hope to see you again soon.